In the Romanesque, of course, there are going to be changes to seating technology, seating design, and we're going to see a couple of very important changes take place. Now, we are really covering the post-Roman period. And the Romans, of course, famously used their banqueting couches, but the Gauls, so the northern French, basically, will be known for sitting on benches or stools at tables to eat. This is going to change how Europe looks at things because Italy is going to be isolated from the rest of Europe during much of the Romanesque because of the Alps and just sort of distance. So when we think of the Romanesque, oftentimes we're thinking of things that are happening in Northern Europe, which is going to be influenced primarily by the Gauls, the Franks, and other groups, all of which had developed during and before the Romans, and all had a tradition of seating on stools or benches. And these benches will tend to be very, very simple construction. This is basically mortise and tenon with, say, 4 parts here. So we see the top, there are holes in the top for the tenons that will come through from the legs, and then we have a stringer along the bottom to make sure the legs don't splay out and split, collapsing and dropping people. Now, this is the simplest form, but of course, people will gussy it up, as it were, and we will see the development of upholstery, these sort of cushions that will be sewn into place in very similar benches. But benches, remember, are easier to create than chairs, and a lot of what's being created is not being created by carpenters. Carpenters, joiners, other skilled craftsmen are primarily working for the upper classes. Anyone beneath that is probably making their own stuff or has a neighbor making it for a small group of people. Now, we'll also see the return of Eastern influence. In this case, it's going to be Byzantine influence. And in the Byzantine, they have a tradition of creating rugs and carpets, something that we will see in the Islamic world, which will come into the Byzantine Empire from Islam. We will see the development of cushions and the use of cushions, and these are going to be particularly wealthy. In fact, in Europe at the time, one of the few things that anyone puts on an estate appraisal in that period is going to be the cushions, because they're frequently silk, they're embroidered. But what we get is a floor culture, very similar to what we saw in China, where people are simply sitting on the floor or on simple stools on occasion. And again, this shift is being driven by the Byzantine, who are taking that tradition primarily from Islam. So you see these connections showing up and ideas moving back and forth between cultures that we tend to think of as very isolated. But from a Romanesque perspective, this sort of floor culture, semi-floor culture, is really useful. Again, that house has a lot of multi-use spaces, and cushions are a lot easier to move around than, say, a couch. Now, there is some furniture, but generally speaking, we're talking the very low middle classes and up. So generally you own some land if you're going to have furniture beyond a simple stool or something along those lines. And we do see the faldstool. Now, this is basically a folding chair. Initially, it's going to be used by a bishop when not occupying the throne or when officiating in a church that isn't their own. The way a bishop works and sort of basic Christian organization is the bishop controls an area called a diocese. And they have a specific church that bishop has as sort of a home church. That is a cathedral. That's the definition of a cathedral, that it is the home of a bishop. But when they travel, which they do frequently to give services in other churches, they need something to show their power, and that's where we get the faldstool. And this should look very familiar because it looks a lot like the Roman curulus, which was a chair used by the magistrate. It became a symbol of authority. Now, these chairs will fold typically, and we see it's not quite the folding chair that we're used to today. but it does fold up, which makes it portable. In other words, they're folding it up so that they can carry it with them to these different churches, to these different events. Eventually, this will find its way into larger use by lords and ladies in the upper classes for much the same reason, that it has that element of authority to it. You don't typically see it amongst the serfs or the so-called working class. Even the merchant class may have one, but it probably sits in a room and never has to move. In the Romanesque, if you're wealthy enough, remember, like I said before, you don't move your furniture from property to property. You simply have multiple properties, each of which is sparsely furnished, and you don't move things back and forth. Now, one of the best examples of this is the chair of Dagobert. And this is gilt bronze. This is coming out of France. And here we see that basic folding chair once again. Now, obviously, it doesn't fold easily. The back has to be slipped into place. These sides more than likely fold down, probably down to the side. We have a fabric piece that would run in between. But it would get across authority at those times when you are moving from place to place. And by the way, the fact that you're seated and not seated on the floor also becomes a symbol of authority. Speaking of which, we have the chair of estate. This is the beginning of the throne. These are generally going to be more ornate chairs, typically with square backs during the Romanesque. And they're going to start as something that you would have, any lord would have in their manor house. Basically, it's a way to, again, show your status. In this case, we're showing status through chairs. Today, we show status through Instagram accounts. It's really the same thing. Every society has its own way of doing it. But this chair of estate, and by the way, this is not a simple chair of estate. This one is for use during the coronation ceremony for the English monarchs, but we will see them expand. We'll see the development of canopy. This, again, comes from Islam via the Byzantine Empire into Europe. This idea of a canopy over the person of status. And the canopy is there originally in Islam to keep the sun off, to keep out of the elements, and that symbolism gets moved indoors into this chair of authority. So that canvas, again, giving you that sense of status, of who this person must be. And of course, we have far more chairs of estate than we do stools and things from the lower classes, because these tend to be passed down through families and carefully taken care of because they are seen as precious elements. Whereas, you know, when you clear out grandma's house, her kitchen chairs generally aren't.